Today we'll be talking about suicide, which might bring up some big feelings, though we will be gentle. You might want to sit this one out or take a bit of time for self-care. You might also want to check out the resources we have listed on our website.
Also, there will be some potty language. So if that's something that might be a bit difficult to hear or you've got kids with you, here's your warning. It's a Minefield is a weekly audio program where we talk getting the most out of life with mental health challenges, with fun and love, to be enjoyed by the whole community.
On It's a Minefield, we speak with well-known and not so well-known Australians about the issues that affect us as we live with these challenges.
It's the mad leading the mad.
We're pretty in sync with each other.
Suicide is something that is close to our hearts. Personally, I have spent much of my life navigating my own suicidality, including several hospitalisations. Significantly, I have experienced a long and successful recovery from these dark times, and I'm both excited and grateful to be chatting with today's guests. Dr. Fiona Shand is one of Australia's foremost experts in suicide prevention. She's a researcher at the Black Dog Institute and at the NHMRC Centre for Research Excellence in Suicide Prevention. She specialises in research on suicide prevention, including treatments for people at risk, the use of technology in suicide prevention, and Australia's First Nations people. Fiona also focuses on community strategies for suicide prevention and people's experiences in the health services following a suicide attempt. Fiona, thanks so much for joining us today.
It's a very great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You have dedicated much of your career to suicide research and prevention. Where did this interest come from?
Yeah, look, I was listening to your own story, Leon, and it reminded me of my own experience, I suppose, as being a support person for someone in my family who I care very deeply about. And this goes back a few decades now. So when I was a teenager, I was supporting a family member through what ended up being a number of suicide attempts. And, you know, I think even as a teenager, I could see that the care that she received, or the lack of, was pretty woeful. And even as a young person, I could see that there had to be something better than this. And so, you know, as a family, we spent a long time trying to find the right support for this person. And thankfully, like you, she survived that series of crises and suicidal thinking and is now doing well. So I think that was really the start of it for me. So I've wended my way through drug and alcohol research, mental health research, suicide prevention, and all of it feels quite personal for me. And so I think my commitment is in trying to make a difference for people when they are struggling, and particularly when they're thinking about suicide.
Dedication and passion often come from that personal touch.
Yeah.
Why do you think people contemplate ending their life?
I think it's really different for each person. So, you know, I think there are sometimes people who live with suicidal thoughts off and on for a long time, or, you know, chronic suicidal thoughts. And that might be in a context of mental ill health, although that's not always the case. You know, we know that many people, for example, might be experiencing depression or anxiety or post-traumatic stress and not be thinking about suicide. And we also know that there are many people who do attempt suicide or die by suicide who don't have a diagnosis of mental illness. So the two don't necessarily go all that closely hand in hand in the way that we might think. But that can often happen. So people are often kind of moving in and out of suicidal thoughts for a long period of time and may act on those thoughts. And it could be in the context of mental illness. It could be in the context of, you know, really chronic life stressors. So, for example, people who live with chronic pain may often think about suicide if they feel like it's inescapable and becomes unbearable. And I think that's one of the keys, is that when people feel trapped in a situation that is unbearable, then suicide might become an option for them. So the mind might send them that way of escaping from that distress that feels unbearable and inescapable. And I think when people have been exposed to suicide, it does kind of open that door for them. We know there are other people who, you know, might be not travelling too badly, but then a really significant crisis hits. So it could be a loss of status around loss of income or loss of employment or loss of relationship. And the thoughts can come up really quickly and they can act on those thoughts really quickly as well. So these are people who don't have a history of mental illness, but for whom the crisis seems really overwhelming.
There is a bit of a myth that it's always attached to mental illness and mental health diagnoses. And when you were talking about that, I know for some people these chronic thoughts of suicide have sometimes acted, I guess, as self-soothing. And for some people they're the one source of comfort to know that there's a solution, but there's many reasons, and as you said, many of them are circumstantial.
Yeah, that's right.
What strategies work for suicide prevention?
Look, there's actually more than you might think now. I think if we look at where the research has come from say 20 or 30 years ago, we know a lot more about the evidence for what works and what doesn't. And I think there's one way of thinking about it which says there are strategies that we can employ at a national level. There are strategies that we can employ for people who might be at risk, and there are strategies we can employ for people who might already be in crisis. So if we look at that kind of universal or national level, there are certain policy levers that we can use. So, for example, providing more generous social welfare payments so that people aren't chronically economically stressed, struggling with housing, etc. We know from international research that actually does make a difference, particularly when we go through a crisis like the global pandemic, like the global financial crisis. We also know that when we change availability of alcohol, that makes a difference to national suicide rates. And again, that's based on fairly good research.
Yep.
So there are policy levers which are not immediately obvious. So they're not health policies, they're other policies, but they're still relevant. We can also look at things like restricting access to the means of suicide. Again, that seems to work. Safe and responsible media reporting, school programs, etc. There are good school programs available. At the next level down, we know that if we provide good access to high-quality mental health care for people who are struggling with depression or anxiety or trauma or substance use, that also reduces our rates. And then at the level of responding to people who are already in crisis, that first point of contact is really critical. So it's really pleasing to see in Australia that we are trialling things like offering safe spaces as an alternative to the emergency department, which isn't always an easy place for people to be. And we're also rolling out aftercare services. So for people who've had a suicidal crisis, making sure they're connected in with good care, particularly for the first 3 months after that crisis, is really critical in terms of preventing people from making another attempt.
Absolutely. What you say about that first point of care is really significant. I know that a lot of people who've attempted suicide have described the treatment they received, especially from emergency staff, as negative or angry or irritated, and that has been my experience. However, I've also been very aware as a consumer and now as a peer worker within the hospital system that this is usually a result of exhaustion and under-resourcing and fatigue.
Yeah, it's interesting that you should say that. That's certainly what we've been learning as well. We've been doing a lot of work in this area lately with hospitals in the ACT and New South Wales. And when we get people who've been to the hospital during suicidal crisis and healthcare workers in the same room together, they're all identifying exactly the same problems, and the staff, as you said, are often working within a system which doesn't support them to provide the best possible care. And that goes from everything from not having enough time, and time is what people need when they're in crisis, through to the physical environment. So emergency departments are busy, loud, bright lights. People are waiting for much, much longer than they should be. And then dealing with staff who are stressed and burnt out. It's not a great recipe, unfortunately. So these safe havens and safe spaces where people can spend the time, where the physical environment is right, and where they're able to talk to people like yourself, peer support workers, who are very compassionate and very empathic. It's just such a better way of helping people to de-escalate from that crisis space.
That's been my experience too. I was surprised how quickly, as a suicide peer support worker, people's attitudes would shift once they learnt that I had been there too. I like that you mentioned the safe havens. Now, safe haven is a new concept, and it's a very generously funded concept and model within New South Wales, and it has existed around the world. What do you know about them?
Yeah, look, as you said, they exist around the world for a long time. So there's been some safe havens in the UK, both residential and non-residential, for some time. And the evaluations that have been done show real promise. In Australia, it's, as you said, it's really new. They're only just starting to be set up now, and they've been thankfully co-designed with people who have a lived experience of suicide. So we're really hoping that they're going to meet a need. And, we certainly know the need is there for some other option rather than the ED. We've actually just been able to secure some funding to evaluate the safe spaces and the safe havens in New South Wales and the ACT. And again, we'll be co-designing that evaluation framework with people who have an experience of suicidal crisis so that we're able to make sure that, we're not just looking at it from the point of view of the funders, but also from the people who are using those services and whether those services are meeting their needs and what else can be done. So, I think they're a really promising option. One of the challenges, of course, is that once people have had a negative experience, is that they're less likely to engage with seeking help the next time round.
Yeah.
So it is about making sure that we are making these services really accessible to the people who need them and people who might have been burned and not be so confident about seeking help.
It is a really, really hard one because when someone is in a suicidal crisis, the emergency department is kind of the only place available and one of the worst places available simultaneously. So it's a really, really difficult situation. So hopefully these safe spaces, which have just started opening up this year, will really kind of challenge that. So I'm hoping that they evaluate well.
Yeah. Look, and I think what our research has shown is that people actually seek and get help from a whole range of informal sources as well. And so it is about being a bit creative, I think, about thinking how else can we support people, but also for either the person who knows that they might be, heading for a crisis or be vulnerable to a crisis, all the people around them to be planning ahead. So, you will probably be really familiar as a peer support worker with this notion of developing a safety plan.
Yeah.
And so, I think having thought ahead about how you might want to receive support when you are in crisis can be a really useful thing to do. And so there's a lovely safety planning app that's available through Beyond Blue called Beyond Now. And I'd really encourage people to have a look at that app and see if they think it might be helpful for them.
Yep.
To perhaps go through it with a friend or a peer support worker or a counsellor or a psychologist and, really explore what it's like to be in that crisis space and how you might want to receive help.
Absolutely. I've got the Beyond Now app on my phone and I can vouch for its usefulness from my perspective.
Yeah, it is, just because I think by the time we hit crisis, it is really hard to think beyond that single solution sometimes, I think. So, and it's really hard to plan and to find a way through that crisis on your own. So I think having that plan already developed in advance just helps to take that little step back from that crisis headspace.
Yep. We're in a time of a pandemic. What sort of things might affect that on a community level?
So I think the pandemic is one of the times, and I've been really pleased to be wrong about something. At the start of this, lots of us who are doing work in suicide prevention were quite fearful about an increase in rates of suicide.
Yep.
Thankfully, so far, we've been proven wrong. And I think although we have seen increasing levels of distress and record levels of calls to helplines, every psychologist and psychiatrist is booked out for weeks or months. That hasn't actually translated to an increase in suicide. So I think there's a few reasons for that. One is that distress doesn't automatically translate into suicidal behaviour. The second is that for some people, they have found really creative ways of staying connected. And I think if we hadn't had online options available to us, it would have been so much more difficult for people. I think there is that sense of, despite all the inequalities, that everyone's kind of going through this at some level together.
Yes.
And there is hope that it will pass. So it's seen as a temporary thing.
Absolutely.
So all of those things help. I also think the fact that the government increased the job seeker payments, relaxed the rules around that, introduced the job keeper payments. Again, as I said, the evidence shows that if you have more generous welfare payments during times of economic downturn, you can prevent that increase in suicide. So I think there's been a whole range of things that have fed into us not seeing the outcomes that we feared. So, I think it just speaks to the importance of staying connected too, as difficult as that might be in times like this.
Yeah, and I've said this before, and this is anecdotal evidence. And as we know, the plural of anecdote is anecdotes, not data. But it's been my experience, and I have spoken to different sort of emergency department nurses and clinicians, and apparently many of the people who have longer term mental health issues have done relatively well, but there has been a new increase in people who've never necessarily had mental health or navigated mental health issues seeking help. So I wonder sometimes if it means those of us who have spent times navigated significant periods of mental distress have actually developed a level of distress tolerance and resilience that's made this year easier.
Yeah, and look, I suppose in my other job, I'm a clinical psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think I'm seeing similar kinds of patterns to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I would agree. I think, one of the things that people who have struggled with psychological distress or trauma or a diagnosis of mental illness are really good at is developing coping strategies and using coping strategies when things get tough. So in some ways, perhaps they're better equipped to cope with these kinds of things. And for the rest of us who, may have thought there was some kind of certainty around our lives, when something like this hits and all of a sudden the world is turned upside down and everything feels really uncertain, that can be a new and slightly terrifying experience, I think.
Totally. So, just lastly, how do you think people could be better allies for those of us who may be experiencing significant distress that could lead to thoughts of suicide?
I have a few thoughts about this, and thinking back to our earlier conversation about what it's like for people when they go to seek help and they feel judged. So the first thing I would say is, suspend judgment, use compassion and use acceptance and be open with the person. And I think some of us might be a bit scared to ask the question. If we can see someone struggling, it can be a little bit scary to ask the person, have you been thinking about suicide or have you had thoughts of death or dying? Because we fear that we might look silly or that we might put the idea into someone's head. And one thing that reassures me is that there's lots and lots of research that asking the question does not put the idea in someone's head. So it's not a dangerous thing to do, right? Yeah. So don't be afraid to ask. If you think someone is struggling, don't be afraid to ask them if they have been thinking about dying or they've had thoughts of suicide. And then, sometimes you might get a no, and then I think you can just reflect on some of the things that you've seen that might concern you. So I'm like, well, look, I've noticed that you haven't been in touch with anyone lately. You seem a bit withdrawn. You've been really quiet. Whatever it is that you're seeing that concerns you, to reflect that back to them. So, just saying, look, I'm just going to check in with you every now and then to see how things are going. So keep coming back to the person. And I think something that you said in your email, Leon, really resonated with me, and that is about hope. Yeah. So I think when a person is thinking about suicide, it's often that loss of hope, right? So in a way, our role is to be the person who holds that hope for them.
Yes.
So it's easy to step into the hopelessness with someone, but it's really important that we don't, because what they're experiencing often is that loss of hope that things can be better. And so we need to be able to hold on to that without being trite about it or without trying to placate them or solve the problem for them. And I think the other thing we can do is just be generous with our listening, and to reflect back what you're hearing from the person and say, look, it sounds like you're having a really rough time. I'm sorry to hear that's the case, and then start to move into, well, what are some of the ways that you might want to be supported and so on. So I think just approaching that whole conversation without judgment, which can be really hard when you're close to the person and you might feel like you're part of the problem.
Yeah.
I think that's how we can be better allies and provide support. I would also say, if you think that you might need to use these skills, there are lots of great training programs around. So there's assist training, there's QPR training, there's lots of options around to skill yourself up. Hop onto Black Dog website, Beyond Blue website, read, learn, and figure out the things you can say.
Brilliant. We'll list those resources too on our website. Fiona, thank you. You're a wonderful ally to people like us who have navigated these difficult times. So I thank you so much.
My pleasure, and all the best.
Thank you. If this has brought up any difficult thoughts or feelings for you, know that you're not alone, although it may feel like that at times. You can access 24-hour support online via chat or phone at the Suicide Callback Service. Go to www.suicidecallbackservice.org.au or you can call Lifeline on 131114. There are people like us who have navigated some pretty dark times and come through the other end. Our experiences and circumstances may differ, and I personally know how intolerable life can seem at times, but it doesn't have to stay that way. I promise.
Welcome back to another Club Mind. I'm Caroline Zavransky, and this is the part of the show where we get three panelists with lived experience to debrief and reflect on the interview we just heard. Today's topic on Club Mind is suicide, so I'd like to provide another safety warning. If this segment brings up any difficult emotions, please stay safe and see the links in our bio and website for places you can reach out to. Welcome to today's Club Mind with Alyse, Brie and Steve. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great. Thanks so much for having us. Hey, Caroline. Thanks for having us.
So you would have listened to the interview with Fiona Shand regarding suicide. What did you guys think of it?
I thought it was really informative. She was pretty clear about it. The fact that it could be linked to mental health challenges, the fact that sometimes it's not, it's hard to tell the difference. Also that suicide is something that can happen to anybody. Suicidal ideation or thoughts of suicide usually dependent on crises or things that you're going through. So it's a really relevant thing, and it touches a lot of people, but it's one of the topics that is not often talked about. Another interesting aspect of her interview is that she talked about it from a systemic level, and I feel that we'll be able to touch on that because a lot of us work in different programs to do with zero suicide at the moment, as well as coming down to hospital level and giving people care and one-on-one if they ever actually express thoughts of suicide or attempt suicide in hospitals.
Yeah, so I similar to Steve, really liked how she took a holistic view of the strategies, that we need, national level policy change and also feeding down into the state level health services, and then also just the individual support that people can offer to family and friends. And I really like how she touched on that, how we can best support people with just really common sense stuff like non-judgment, acceptance, compassion, and just ongoing support and active listening and being with the person through it.
So I can also relate, to what she said in the radio program about how she had a friend who went through a suicidal crisis and eventually got through it. But I was actually a young carer for someone experiencing long-term mental health issues and a suicidal crisis who eventually took their own life. So it was something that was completely devastating and that has still stayed with me. And sometimes I still experience flashbacks, heavy body memory. Also, as a carer, you carry a lot of guilt that you could have done more, racing thoughts about all the should-have, could-haves and would-haves. What if I'd done this differently? What if I'd done that? So there's an incredible amount of guilt, harbouring, self-blame and regret attached to caring for somebody who ends their life, along with deep pangs of bewilderment and disbelief, which also adds to the distress. So I was a young person at 24 and it reconfigured my whole identity, shook me to the core, and I was also a consumer too, so a person living with my own mental distress, which impacted the grief and bereavement even harder. But I was eventually able to get through it. But I've discovered that it's actually quite common for people to be both carers and have a lived experience of mental and emotional distress. And I think as peer workers, we do a lot of kind of accidental caring. A lot of our friends, experience mental distress. So we're doing a lot of unpaid caring work well.
I was about to say another point that kind of came up through the interview, and a great point to remember is remembering to kind of ask people that kind of the "are you okay" day being every day, because sometimes you don't ask enough. I found during especially this COVID-19 and people not working, that through just general conversations, I've learned that friends of mine who I never would have guessed go through mental health challenges. They might be going through depression. They might be going through a bit of anxiety, and that things are going on for people in the mental health sphere all the time. And if you don't broach those conversations, and to not be afraid to kind of ask how people are doing mentally, because a lot of the time they just don't know where to go, who to ask, or who to talk to.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I also liked how she suggested, keep checking in on people regularly and don't be afraid to ask. So all those campaigns of the Are You OK days, they're really quite helpful. And yeah, I guess it's just breaking down that whole taboo, isn't it? And just having conversations around it. Like, why is suicide still seen as such a dirty word when it's so prevalent? And, one of the leading causes of death worldwide.
Definitely, and especially in males as well. Like, I know the statistics aren't great for that. But definitely the ongoing support is definitely really important, and there's no wrong way to ask the question. I think there's a lot of myths about like putting the idea in someone's head, or you can ask the wrong way and things like that. But I think if you genuinely are coming from a empathetic place, I think you can't really ask the wrong way.
Yeah, that's right, because the person is able to sense that you genuinely care and that you're holding the hope for them and that you're willing to be there with them through that journey. And so just being there and holding that hope and just checking in can often, really save someone's life. Yeah, also, as Steve was mentioning, sometimes we have no idea that people are feeling this way, and a lot of people who put on this front of, happiness and success, you'll often hear from the families, they were so happy the day before, and then the next day they took their life, and it just came completely out of the blue. So sometimes there are signs early on, and there's a build-up of them, and then they kind of wave and ebb and flow, and then sometimes it is hidden. Yeah, it's really helpful to keep having those conversations, keep checking, keep those lines of communications open, even if you think the person looks okay and is doing well. We have no idea what they're actually going through underneath.
For sure, we get really good at wearing masks, don't we? And just being like, I'm fine and everything's okay. And I think that's another thing. Don't be afraid to ask again. If this person says no the first time, they might not want to talk about it at that point in time. But if you're still concerned, just come from that caring place and just say, look, I just want to check in again, see how you're doing, especially if there's been like a big significant event in their life. Grief and loss can come in many forms, not just losing a loved one. It can be, losing a job or something that's been a significant part of their life.
I would also say another thing is spreading awareness. I mean, a lot of people are really interested or have people who might have suicidal ideation in their lives. For example, I used to work in Safe Haven. I work in a sort of suicide prevention outreach program, as Brie. And for example, they asked me to go and speak at a men's shed out in Menai. And they had all sorts of questions. They had friends who were going through stuff. And sometimes it's just about getting the knowledge out there. And I think maybe that's one thing. We need to get more information out there to people about what they can do, how they can help, where they can go, and that sort of thing.
Steve, do you mind just elaborating a little bit on what Safe Haven is?
Okay, Safe Haven is part of what we call the Zero Suicide program, which is an initiative from the Ministry of Health, where they're spending, I think, $20 million or so over 3 years on a couple of initiatives, one of which is Safe Haven. So Safe Haven is basically an alternative to emergency department for people who might be having emotional distress or suicidal ideation, although you can go there for any reason pretty much, whether you're suffering from isolation, you're just feeling bad, you want to talk to. It's backed by people with lived experience, as well as having a clinician on site, just in case they're needed. There's one at Cogra. There's a brand new one that was, COVID is maybe stopping it from getting started, but I think it was meant to start July 5th at St. Vincent. There's one in Hunter, but eventually, basically, they're meant to be rolled out, basically 20 of them in sites across New South Wales, and they're a really exciting new initiative. People who come to them just say it's made a difference in their lives. They form a community. They come back for repeated visits. They're less likely to use emergency services, which probably aren't the best place for somebody who's got suicidal ideation to spend, because you spend 4 hours or something in there. You're not a first priority because mental health challenges aren't always the most obvious emergency department thing. They'll take somebody with a broken arm before they'll take somebody in severe emotional distress a lot of the time. And sometimes it's just a Band-Aid solution. So it's more a thing that they can go to long-term, form friendships, get support, and that sort of thing.
So Safe Haven is New South Wales based. Alyse or Brie, do you want to elaborate on how other states could form equally as inclusive programs for suicidality?
Well, the Safe Haven initiative actually came out of Victoria. And so the one in Cogra, I think, was one of the first in the southeastern Sydney local district. It actually shares the space with us at the Recovery and Wellbeing College. I think it's been going for nearly 6 months now. But yeah, they did a lot of research and adapted it from the model in Victoria.
Yeah, so Safe Haven was kind of developed as a place for an alternative to the emergency department, and this is one of those questions that you're welcome to not answer, but have you ever felt cautious speaking about your suicidal thoughts due to the fear of being hospitalised, when in fact you just wanted someone to chat to?
I mean, you know, I've lived with experience of suicidal crisis, and for me, I didn't actually want to die, but I wanted the pain to stop and to escape it. So suicidality was actually part of my own language that I was using and speaking to express my pain. And so I've worked as a peer worker in the public mental health system for 8 years now. And early on in my career, we were lucky enough to be provided with training in intentional peer support, which is a framework and way of working with people. It was developed in the 90s by Sherry Mead, and IPS also discusses suicide as a language of pain. So I really love this way of describing suicidal crisis because it challenges the actual idea of intervention by not beginning with an assumption that there is a problem, but instead seeing it as part of the person's language in how they're expressing their pain. And so this in turn allows the opportunity to meet people where they're at and build powerful, trusting relationships. So certainly, you know, there's so many consumers who are afraid to go into suicidal distress, you know, for fear of being hospitalised, being forced treatment against their will, all of that. There's a huge amount of fear. And so this is a Safe Haven and emergency alternative departments offer, you know, as an alternative way to actually express your pain and not have it being pathologized and diagnosed and, you know, wrapped up in this box where you're told to take medication and it'll all go away. You know, this is a real environment where you can express yourself and be with other people who are also, you know, openly in conversations about their distress without fear of being judged. And so I think it's incredible, you know, and none of this was around like even 5 years ago. It's an amazing breakthrough in the system.
While we're here, I might actually take the opportunity to plug Spark as well.
Yeah, I'm thinking that.
Which is another initiative that Brie and I work on in Sutherland and is also being rolled out across New South Wales. What it is, we usually work with people who are having a first instance of emotional distress or suicidal ideation. And it's usually due to situational crisis. So it could be anything from domestic violence to somebody having their kids taken away and taken overseas and they're not coping so well. Cases where somebody's lost a partner or lost employment due to COVID and it's affecting them badly, whatever situation they might be in. And it's an initiative where we kind of go out in pairs from the hospital with a clinician and a peer worker with lived experience, work with them for a period of 4 to 6 weeks and link them into the community or to services if they still need them after 4 to 6 weeks. But most cases show a lot of improvement and are able to kind of proceed without help, or they get linked into a psychologist or talk services. Brie, I don't know if there's anything more you want to say about that?
Similar to what you were saying, Alyse, a lot of the time people are just feeling really overwhelmed and like life is unbearable at that point in time. So a a lot of the time it's just meeting them where they're at and just sharing that space with them, letting them know they're not alone, helping them link in with supports that they might need, or helping them explore their own solutions. People are the experts in their own lives. They know what's going to be best for them. So a lot of the time it's just helping them explore and discover what's going to be helpful for them. You see people come out the other end, like, don't want to talk up the program too much because I'm biased, but you definitely see people like at the start of their journey where they're just completely overwhelmed and in a lot of psychological pain, and then just, you know, working through it for the 6 weeks and coming out the other side like a lot more equipped to manage and built so much resilience as well, so that they hopefully aren't going through the revolving door of the system.
Something they chatted about, which is very underspoken, and that's the chronic feeling of suicide as being a source of comfort. And I know this hits close to home for me. That feeling of, in the suicide training I've done in my job, it's like a escape hatch. That's what they called it. What are your thoughts on feeling suicidal as almost a sense of comfort?
It's an escapism. It's almost like a self-medicating tool, you know, like to have those thoughts to think, wow, you know, I could just end it all. Like I could be out of this pain. I could just disappear and it would all go away. And certainly for people, it is a comfort, and that's actually what helps them get through. These are a huge coping mechanism for people.
It's having that like option in the back of your mind, I guess. Like it feels like, it's not a scary thing. It's just like an option that's there that would solve all your problems.
Generally, you've just kind of reached a point where it's almost kind of like you had enough, and it's a door that you could go through, but you could not. I mean, in my experience, my suicidal ideation was when I was a lot younger, and when I was kind of dealing with my diagnosis, and I kind of lost a bit of hope. And not to go into detail or anything, but I didn't have access to means, but I, for example, didn't eat. And I'm a 100-kilo guy and dropped down to 55 kilos. So I just kind of, you just kind of, I don't know if it's losing the will, or you're just in a situation that's so dark that you just kind of think you might be a little bit better off not being here, and having that option in the back of your mind does give security. And working with people, sometimes some people have needs, or they're thinking about things, and it just gives them, they do feel a little bit more secure knowing that they could kind of get away from whatever is bothering them.
What did you think about holding hope for someone who feels suicidal? Not trying to change their mind, not trying to solve the issue, but holding hope for someone in the epitome of hopelessness.
I think that's why peer support is so valuable, because you've been there, you've hit rock bottom, you know what it's like, and you can just have a chat with someone. You don't even necessarily need to share what you've been through, but just for them to know that you've been on that journey and of recovery, and, you know, you can provide that sort of hope at the end of the tunnel sort of thing, and hold that for them and let them know that that's possible and that things can get better, and just because today is awful and horrible doesn't mean that tomorrow has to be.
I agree with Brie 100% and what she just said. I mean, sometimes I express it to people that if, you know, my 26-year-old self could have met my 43-year-old self and kind of known that things got better, or if I'd had peer workers around in the early days to provide an example to say that, you know, you can get through this. Time makes things better. There will be better treatments. Don't lose hope. It really makes a difference. And we also find that in Safe Haven, as well as in the SPART program and things that we work in terms of suicide prevention, people really love the fact that it's not just about clinicians or the medical system telling them what to do, but actually having people who have been through it. Because again, with depression, with suicidality, with things like that, sometimes you don't, as we said, you don't need words to describe what you've really been through. Just having been through it, there's a certain connection that allows you to kind of bond, build rapport. Even though you might have strategies that help you get through it, everybody's unique. So you kind of just look at the bits that you have in common, give a few ideas, and help them hopefully be able to build up self-resilience. And yeah, as you said, we hold hope for them.
We've got to wrap it up now, unfortunately. You guys have done an amazing job. Is there any last words you want to add before I sign you guys off?
I'd just like to say that I think it's incredibly powerful as peer workers to be able to sit with people in spaces of not knowing and of discomfort and not fixing things, not doing things, but just being there with them through their distress. I think that's an actual, wonderful skill of peer workers, and it's a really powerful technique.
And I'd just like to say one of the things I've learned is to never give up on people. It's sometimes a constant battle. It's one that we don't always win, but we owe it to the people that we work with to constantly try to instill hope, because every life is valuable, basically.
You just heard from Alyse, Brie and Steve, who are 3 panellists from It's a Minefield, who all have lived experience. They debriefed on the interview you heard from Fiona Shand regarding suicide. Thank you all so much for your insight and sharing your thoughts. It's been a pleasure chatting to you.
No worries.
Yeah.
Thanks, Caroline.
Our pleasure.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, Chris.
Hey, Leon.
Sex. Old people. Go.
Oh, okay. So I think it's something that, people just don't want to think about.
Yeah, it's true. Or don't want to talk about.
Yeah. And if you look at nursing homes and places like that, sex often doesn't have a place to play.
And I think that's a shame. But there are people who are changing that.
That's awesome.
How good is that?
So good.
Well, I've got this great interview for you.
Who's the interview with?
Julie Bates.
Julie Bates.
I call her the Dame.
The Dame. Dame Julie Bates.
Dame Julie Bates. Julie Bates has been a sex worker and activist for more than 4 decades. She's been at the forefront of the Australian sex worker rights movement since the early 80s. In 1986, she secured government funding to form the Australian Prostitutes Collective New South Wales, an advocacy organisation for the human and legal rights of sex workers, which still exists today as SWAP, the Sex Worker Outreach Project. In 2018, she was made an Officer of the Order of Australia in the Queen's Birthday Honours, recognising the work she's done to champion the rights of sex workers and mobilise the sex industry against the spread of HIV/AIDS. Julie describes herself as a senior citizen and continues working in the sex industry. Her primary clients today are people with dementia, many currently residing in aged care facilities. I sat down with her to discuss this aspect of her work.
Sex work has always been something that I've come back to and left and come back to, I think I've been pretty privileged in that way because it can be a hard job. It's either the easiest job on the planet when you're sitting there counting your money after they've gone, or it's the fucking hardest job on the planet for a variety of reasons. And it's not, I'm not talking hard physically. There are emotional aspects to it as well. And you're dealing with people sometimes who have a range of psychosocial needs, and you're often helping with them. And from my perspective, being a senior member of society now, and our community, and still coming back to sex work, remarketing myself when I was about 60. A lot of my calls have come, this is just amazing, I love it, from the seriously adult daughters of dads who are in their 80s in nursing homes. Dad's in a nursing home, he's got dementia and he's suffering from this thing called sundowners syndrome. And so it's about 4:00 in the afternoon it seems to hit, where they get very sad, very confused and disoriented. They want to go home and they want their mum. So I tend to go in around that time as a kind of distraction for that. But so what I do, I get to know lots about who they are from, one family. Then I've got the son ringing me up too going, look, I think I know what Dad likes. Okay, too much information, thank you. I don't need that. I will work that out for myself, And the daughter ringing up, he's a bastard, don't talk to him. So you got brother and sister at war trying to book a hooker for Dad. So you try to find out as much as you can. And also you need to know, can they give informed consent? Because people say, if a person's got dementia or they've got a profound cognitive disability. How can they give consent? Well, if they've been able to tell you this morning what they like for breakfast, they can make some decisions. Or what colour socks they want to wear, you know? There are ways to deduce whether they can give informed consent, you know? Anyway, so you're sort of trying to find out a little bit about their history as well, who they were, you know? Like when you get to their homes or their rooms, usually their rooms in the nursing homes, you've got pictures and you're seeing these gorgeous, handsome boys in their prime of their lives with their families, you know, on the walls, you know. Some people say, how could you see some crippled up old dude? I'm going, I just see a beautiful human being that's had a life, you know.
Yeah. I'm trying to find a way to say it. What's it like to have clients die, I guess?
It's an inevitability when you're seeing clients who are in their 80s and 90s, you know. And often they are in poor health. So they're probably not long for this world when you're seeing them. Yeah. I was in the middle of the Surrey Hills supermarket, Coles, and the daughter rang and said, and she's crying her heart out to tell me Dad had died, and through the tears to tell me thank you. So they're very moving sessions, and I sometimes come out of those in tears, you know, because of the humanity of it. Yeah. And it will be me. Yeah. Well, not necessarily me booking a hooker, but, you know, if I could, maybe I would. Yeah. But, you know, when you're old, and you just put in a room somewhere, you know.
There's this real taboo that we have, it seems, around old people and sexuality. But I think, as you've said, it's got something to do with touch and with a lot more than genitals. Yeah. You know?
I have to say, these old boys could get an erection still, you know?
Yeah.
With a bit of help, you know. I've got a few tricks, you know. But they can. And so it wasn't all just feely, touchy. You know, there was some serious sex happening for some of them. Yeah. But one of the clients, they're in their hospital beds, but I have instructions about what I want when I get there. I want towels for myself. Yep. I want they're not only wearing nappies, adult nappies, they're wearing these paddy things on their hips in case they fall down. Yep. So I arrived looking like, I don't know, librarian. Hello everyone, hello. So I get into the room and I start, you know, making eye contact and trying to get a sense of, does he know what I'm there for? And, you know, and then I pop into the bathroom and slip into something more comfortable, which is, you know, sort of lacy thing, blacky, lacy, you know, negligee type things, fishnets, you know, high heels. I always ask too, what's their favourite tipple? And most of these old boys, you know, they like sherry. Yep. And I'd always take a piece of, I'd find out what's their favourite food, you know, and take a little cake or something, you know. Anyway, so I pour the sherries and I sit in the lap. And the door flies open, and it's this young male orderly. He's going, oh, my God, what are you doing to Mr. Smith? My God. And I said, it's okay, just go see the boss. She knows exactly what I'm doing with Mr. Smith. Yeah. And close the door after you, please, and don't come back unless you knock.
Good on you.
So next time you're in a nursing home, put the chock of wood under the door. Brilliant. So no one can open it uninvited.
That's a perfect gift.
But I reckon that one, you know, sometimes I think that they do it on purpose because they want to, I'm training up their staff for them, you know.
Yeah. What's the aged care sector like? How are you received in aged care facilities?
Oh, wonderfully.
Really?
Wonderfully. Absolutely wonderfully. Ah. But, you know, so you've negotiated well, though, first of all, with the daughter or the son or the family member, or sometimes it's a social worker, right? A good orgasm, too, can actually help relieve muscle tensions and other things, you know. And they know exactly, you know, what you're expecting from this, and it's about money as well, and, you know, I don't do all the rest of it. And I'll be there at a certain time, and I just walk in and good afternoon, you know. Dementia, losing the frontal lobe capacity, makes you a little bit disinhibited. And so they're masturbating in front of old ladies over cream cakes, you know.
Yeah, not the right thing to do in front of cream cakes. The Governor-General awarded you an Order of Australia on behalf of the Queen.
He presented me.
He presented you an Order of Australia medal on behalf of the Queen. How are you notified of this?
Came in an email.
Right.
One morning. I spend my day, I have a ritual. I don't like mornings, but I do get up at about 8:30 and I make coffee and I go back to bed with my laptop And I spend the morning going through my emails. I might, if I'm writing a presentation for something or a journal article or whatever, research, I do a little work in bed to start with. And in comes this thing, and it's got the Queen's crown on it. And I go, oh, that looks pretty interesting, doesn't it? But it did pass my mind for a minute going, oh, what have I done now? But I have to say, my dear mate across the ditch, Dame Catherine Healy, who also received a damehood, right, like a similar thing, but they retained the knights and dames that Tony Abbott wanted to bring back. So you'd be looking at a dame if he got away with that. So I saw the crown and I'm thinking, oh, God, what have I done? This looks pretty serious. In it said, dear Miss Bates, we've been trying to reach you for some time. We've sent letters and we've not been able to reach you. So we've now got this email address. We're writing to ask you if you would be prepared to accept an Order of Australia.
How did that feel?
Well, at the very moment I can hear all these voices going, no, colonialism, blah, 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 invasions. You have to say no, Julie. But by lunchtime, I went, fuck that. No, I'm saying yes, because I know how much benefit this can be to not me necessarily, but to what I've been working on for all these years. So it's going to open more doors. There's going to be a whole lot more work, I know, but it's going to open more doors and it's going to give me a bigger voice for the voiceless.
Absolutely.
As I try and raise up those other voices. So in the afternoon, I wrote back and said, thank you very much. I would be delighted to accept that.
Yep. And why is sex work stigmatised?
Well, it's something to do with sex, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's about people's fear, people's thoughts and understanding. If you're engaged in the business of sex, but you're not married, and so it's all the down through the ages of the stigmatisation of the people who do that work. Although there have been periods in our history where my kind have been quite revered, but generally speaking, people don't have a lot of respect for sex workers because it's in their minds to what they imagine we do. My God. So that's what it's about. It's about people's unease, sense of disgust, seen too many American movies. So there's that continual kind of sense of we don't want you in our backyard.
Yeah. Yeah, that is.
But we're there.
Incredibly hypocritical too. Oftentimes, sometimes the most moralistic people, our clients, are engaging in acts that they'll publicly declare against.
That's right. That's right.
How can we be better allies?
Oh, what a question! What a question! That's a beautiful question. You're being an ally right now by inviting me to this interview. You're helping spread that word. You can talk about it to your friends. Talk about sex workers. We are people. Sex work is work. Get over yourselves.
Yep, and it's a community service, and it's a service, and it makes
it's a service like going to your physiotherapist or your chiropractor.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you've gone through a lot and haven't become and still. You're not disillusioned. You come out still. No.
And people say to me, "Why do you bother? Why do you bother?"
Yeah.
I have seen changes.
Yeah.
It might have taken 3 decades.
Yeah.
But I've seen changes. So you don't ever think that don't bother.
Yeah.
If lots of people thought don't bother, we wouldn't probably have lots of things that we rely upon to live our day-to-day lives.
Yeah. Well, I'm really grateful. Thank you so much for coming. I learnt a lot more about you than I knew before. So thank you. I'm so grateful, Julie.
Oh, my pleasure, Leon.
Dame Julie Bates has joined us and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, Kaz.
Hey, Leon.
What did you think of the interview with Julie?
I really love that she was speaking about sexual health as part of a holistic health approach.
Yeah.
And I found my mind wandering to try to pinpoint when in society sex became a dirty thing that wasn't something that we could openly speak about or feel that we say we require our sexual needs to be met. And I was thinking, is it a religious thing? Like, what is it? Like, there was a point in time when everybody understood that humans had sexual needs and we need to have them met. And it's so much more than just bumping uglies. It's emotional.
Totally.
It's spiritual. It's the physical contact. I mean, humans would die without the touch of another human being. And loneliness is such a big killer. And it's not just the kind of intimacy that you can get before, after, during a sexual act. It's very hard to replicate.
Yeah. That's what I noticed too. It was quite touching when she talked about sundowner syndrome, you know, and guys with dementia at a certain time want their mum, you know? And that was about intimacy and love in a very different way. Yeah. It was quite touching. When do you reckon society turned off sex?
I'm just going back in my mind, you know, thinking, well, the cavemen, they all walked around naked and they had sex for reproduction, and maybe that wasn't that much of an intimacy thing. But then you kind of went into like the era where sex workers start to exist and STI start to exist and religion and, you know, no sex before marriage, like somewhere in between there. Somewhere in between where sex was purely for procreation and then religion was introduced and it was a sin. So somewhere between there.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you listened. I wanted to get your opinion on that. So thanks for joining, Kaz.
Loved it.
Thank you for tuning in to It's a Minefield. This program has been kindly funded by the Mental Health Commission of New South Wales and broadcast on community radio station 2RRR in Sydney. Produced by Leon Fernandez,
Caroline Savransky,
Chris Jager, with executive producer Jeff Furlow. You can reach out to us on Instagram and Facebook with the handle It's a Minefield, or get in touch via email info@iamf.org.au. See you on the flip side, June bugs.